Barack Obama never imagined that a casual comment about White House Press Secretary Caroline Levitt's marriage would trigger the most brutal political takedown of his post-presidential career, when he dismissed her as another pretty face married to power rather than principle. He awakened something fierce in the youngest press secretary in American history. What followed wasn't just a defense of her personal life, it was a systematic destruction of Obama's carefully constructed legacy that exposed the gap between his soaring rhetoric and his actual governing record. In 60 seconds of devastating television, Levit would prove that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most experience but the one with nothing left to lose. The comment came during what was supposed to be a friendly interview on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, part of Barack Obama's ongoing effort to maintain his relevance in the Trump era, while positioning himself as the elder statesman of American politics. Obama had been discussing the current state of political discourse when Colbert asked him about the younger generation of political figures who were rising to prominence. "Well, Stephen, I think we're seeing a mix of genuine public servants and people who are essentially political performers," Obama said in his familiar measured cadence. Take someone like the current press secretary Caroline Levitt. She's clearly intelligent and articulate, but you have to wonder if she's there because of her qualifications or because she married well and looks good on television. The comment was delivered with Obama's characteristic blend of apparent reasonableness and subtle condescension, but the implications were devastating. He wasn't just questioning Levitt's professional qualifications, he was suggesting that her marriage was a political calculation and that her success was based on appearance rather than ability. I mean, let's be honest, Obama continued, warming to his theme. The current administration seems to prioritize loyalty and aesthetics over experience and expertise. When you choose a press secretary who's never worked in journalism, never held a senior government position, and whose primary qualification seems to be her willingness to defend anything the president says, you're not really serving the public interest. Colbert, sensing good television, pressed further. Are you saying that Caroline Levitt isn't qualified for her position? I'm saying that the American people deserve better than pretty faces reading talking points. Obama replied, his tone carrying just enough deniability to avoid direct accusations while making his meaning perfectly clear. Democracy requires serious people who understand the complexity of governance, not social media personalities who happen to be married to the right connection. The interview aired on Thursday night and immediately went viral, not because Obama had said anything particularly shocking, but because he had made the tactical error of personally attacking someone who had built her career on defending against much more sophisticated opponents than a former president trading on past glory. By Friday morning, clips of Obama's comments were being shared across every social media platform, with political commentators speculating about whether the former president had crossed a line by making personal attacks on a sitting government official's marriage and appearance. But it was the response from the White House that would transform Obama's casual insult into a career-defining moment for both participants. The president will be making a statement about former President Obama's comments during today's press briefing, Press Secretary Caroline Levitt announced through her official social media accounts. The American people deserve to know the truth about failed leadership and empty rhetoric. Political insiders immediately recognized the significance of the announcement. Levitt wasn't just going to defend herself against Obama's personal attacks, she was going to use his comments as a launching pad for a systematic assault on his presidential legacy. This is going to be extraordinary, observed CNN's Anderson Cooper during live coverage of the building confrontation. Caroline Levitt has been one of the most aggressive defenders of the Trump administration, and now Obama has essentially challenged her to a political duel. If she handles this right, it could establish her as a major political figure in her own right. But it was the research that Levit's team had been conducting that would make her response far more devastating than anyone anticipated. For months, her staff had been compiling a comprehensive analysis of Obama's policy failures and the gap between his public image and his actual governing record, preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. We've been waiting for someone to give us an opening to talk about Obama's real legacy, one senior White House official told reporters on Background. His comments about Caroline's marriage and qualifications just handed us the perfect platform to discuss his administration's failures and hypocrisies. As Friday afternoon approached and the press briefing drew near, political Washington braced for what promised to be one of the most dramatic confrontations in recent political memory. Obama, the smooth-talking former president with a carefully cultivated image of dignity and competence, versus Levit, the young firebrand who had built her reputation on fearlessly attacking anyone who challenged the Trump administration. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define both of their political futures. The 48 hours between Obama's insult and Levit's scheduled response transformed the White House communications operation into something resembling a war room. Caroline Levit, far from being the unqualified pretty face that Obama had described, revealed the strategic intelligence and meticulous preparation that had actually earned her the position of press secretary. "I want every policy failure, every broken promise, and every hypocritical statement that Obama made during his 8 years in office," she told her senior staff during an emergency meeting in the Roosevelt Room. "But I don't want talking points or partisan attacks. I want facts, figures, and documented evidence that even his supporters can't dispute." The team that assembled around Levit included some of the most skilled researchers and policy analysts in government, people who had been quietly documenting the failures of previous administrations while building the case for Trump's policy successes. What they produced over the next 2 days was a comprehensive indictment of Obama's presidency that went far beyond typical political criticism. The genius of Obama's political brand is that he's managed to separate his personal image from his policy record, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the White House's senior policy analyst. "People remember the soaring rhetoric and the historic symbolism of his presidency, but they've forgotten the actual results of his policies." The research team had identified 17 major policy areas where Obama's administration had failed to deliver on its promises while creating problems that the Trump administration had been forced to address. From foreign policy disasters in Libya and Syria to the economic stagnation that had persisted throughout most of his presidency, the documented record painted a picture that was dramatically different from Obama's carefully maintained public image. But it was the personal research that would make Levit's response truly devastating. Her team had uncovered evidence that Obama's comments about marriage and political calculations were particularly hypocritical, given his own family's relationship with political power and personal enrichment. Obama criticized Caroline for marrying well, but his own wife's career trajectory was entirely dependent on her husband's political success, observed White House Communications Director Stephen Chung. Michelle Obama went from being a hospital administrator, making $121,000 per year, to commanding $65 million book deals and Netflix contracts worth hundreds of millions. If we're talking about people who benefited from marrying into political power, the Obamas wrote the playbook. The financial analysis was particularly damaging because it revealed the extent to which the Obama family had monetized their political success in ways that previous first families had avoided. From speaking fees that exceeded $400,000 per appearance to production deals and book contracts that generated massive wealth, the Obamas had transformed public service into a pathway to unprecedented personal enrichment. But Levit's preparation went beyond policy analysis and financial investigations. She had been studying Obama's communication style, identifying the rhetorical techniques that had made him such an effective political performer and developing strategies for neutralizing his advantages while exploiting his weaknesses. Obama's strength is his ability to sound reasonable and measured even when he's being completely dishonest, Levit explained to her team. But that only works when he's not being directly challenged with specific facts and evidence. When you force him to defend his actual record rather than his rhetorical vision, he becomes much less effective. The strategy that emerged from this analysis was both simple and brilliant. Instead of engaging in the kind of defensive posture that most political figures adopted when attacked by someone of Obama's stature, Levit would go on the offensive, immediately using his personal attack as justification for a comprehensive examination of his presidential legacy. "We're not going to defend against his characterizations," she told her staff during their final preparation session. "We're going to make him defend his 8 years of policy failures while explaining why someone who left office with such a poor record thinks he has the credibility to criticize anyone else's qualifications." But it was the timing and format of her response that would make it truly effective. Instead of issuing a written statement or giving interviews to friendly media outlets, Levit had decided to use the daily press briefing as her platform, ensuring maximum coverage while controlling the narrative environment. "The beauty of doing this at the press briefing is that I'll have a captive audience of journalists who will be forced to cover the story, and Obama won't be able to respond in real time, she explained. By the time he figures out how to counter what I'm saying, the damage will already be done and the story will have moved on. As Friday afternoon approached and the White House press corps gathered for what they sensed would be an extraordinary briefing, Levit made her final preparations. She had distilled her comprehensive research into a series of specific documented criticisms that could be delivered with devastating effect in just a few minutes of television time. This isn't just about defending myself against his personal attacks, she told her husband during a private conversation that morning. This is about exposing the gap between Obama's carefully constructed image and his actual record of failure. If I do this right, it will change how people think about his presidency for years to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either establish Levit as a major political force or destroy her credibility if she failed to deliver on the massive expectations she had created. The White House press briefing room had never felt more electric than it did at 2:00 p.m. on that Friday afternoon. Every major news network was carrying the briefing live. Political Twitter was buzzing with anticipation, and even normally cynical Washington journalists seemed genuinely excited about what they were about to witness. Caroline Levitt walked to the podium with the confident stride of someone who had spent days preparing for this moment. Dressed in a sharp navy suit that projected both professionalism and authority, she carried herself with the poise of someone half her age who had already mastered the art of political combat. Before we begin with questions, I'd like to address some comments made by former President Obama during his appearance on late-night television. She began, her voice carrying none of the defensive tone that political observers had expected. Instead, she sounded like a prosecutor preparing to present evidence to a jury. Mr. Obama suggested that I was chosen for my position based on my appearance and my marriage rather than my qualifications. He implied that I'm merely a pretty face reading talking points who doesn't understand the complexity of governance. She paused, letting the weight of Obama's insults sink in with the press corps. I find these comments particularly interesting coming from someone whose own administration's record demonstrates such a profound gap between soaring rhetoric and actual results. The room was completely silent, with even the most experienced journalists recognizing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in modern political discourse. Let's talk about complexity of governance, shall we? Levit continued, pulling out a series of prepared documents. During his 8 years in office, President Obama presided over the slowest economic recovery since the Great Depression, with GDP growth averaging just 1.5%, compared to the 3.1% average we've achieved under President Trump. The first statistic was devastating in its simplicity, but Levit was just getting started. He promised to reduce healthcare costs for the average American family by $2,500 per year. Instead, premiums increased by an average of $4,865 per year. He promised a transparent administration but prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. He promised to end America's wars but left office with the country engaged in more military conflicts than when he started. Each fact was delivered with precision and supported by documented evidence that flashed on the screens behind her. This wasn't partisan rhetoric, it was a systematic presentation of verifiable policy failures. But let's talk about marriage and political calculations, since Mr. Obama seems so interested in that topic, Levit said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. I find it fascinating that someone whose wife went from a $121,000 hospital job to commanding $65 million book deals wants to lecture anyone about the relationship between marriage and career advancement. The shot was perfectly aimed and devastatingly effective. Obama had opened himself to this line of attack by making personal comments about Levit's marriage, and she was now turning his own vulnerability against him. Michelle Obama has earned over $200 million since leaving the White House through speaking engagements, book deals, and Netflix contracts. Are we supposed to believe that these opportunities came her way because of her qualifications as a hospital administrator or because she happened to be married to a former president? But it was the foreign policy section of her response that truly demolished Obama's carefully maintained image as a competent statesman. Mr. Obama wants to talk about understanding complexity. Let's discuss his understanding of Middle Eastern complexity. Levit continued, her voice growing stronger with each devastating fact. His decision to withdraw from Iraq created the power vacuum that led to ISIS controlling territory the size of Great Britain. His intervention in Libya turned a stable country into a failed state with open slave markets. His red line in Syria was crossed repeatedly while he did nothing, leading to over 500,000 deaths. His Iran nuclear deal provided $150 billion to the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, while sunset clauses virtually guaranteed they would have nuclear weapons within 15 years. His Russian reset ended with Russia annexing Crimea and interfering in American election. The systematic destruction of Obama's foreign policy legacy was breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its accuracy. Each failure was documented, each consequence was measurable, and each policy disaster could be traced directly to decisions made by the Obama administration. But it was the conclusion that transformed the entire confrontation from a personal dispute into a defining moment of political communication. So when former President Obama questions my qualifications and suggests that I don't understand the complexity of governance, I think the American people are entitled to ask what exactly in his record of policy failures qualifies him to judge anyone else's competence. She paused, looking directly into the camera that she knew was broadcasting her words to millions of Americans. I may be young, I may be married to someone in politics, and I may be attractive enough that former presidents feel comfortable making sexist comments about my appearance. But unlike Mr. Obama, I don't have to defend 8 years of broken promises, policy disasters, and economic stagnation. I don't have to explain why the most transparent administration in history prosecuted more journalists than any president before or since. And I don't have to justify why someone who promised hope and change delivered economic malaise and foreign policy catastrophes. If Mr. Obama wants to debate qualifications and competence, I suggest he start by explaining his own record to the American people who lived through the consequences of his failures. The briefing room erupted as journalists processed what they had just witnessed. In less than 5 minutes, Levit had systematically dismantled not just Obama's personal attack, but his entire presidential legacy, using documented facts and evidence that even his supporters would struggle to dispute. The immediate response was unprecedented. Social media exploded with clips from the briefing. Cable news networks interrupted regular programming to analyze what had happened, and political commentators from across the spectrum acknowledged that they had witnessed something extraordinary. I've covered politics for 30 years and I've never seen anything like that, CNN's Wolf Blitzer said during live coverage immediately following the briefing. Caroline Levit didn't just defend herself, she completely destroyed Barack Obama's political legacy in a way that may permanently change how his presidency is remembered. But perhaps the most telling response came from Obama himself, whose Twitter account remained silent for the first time in years as his team struggled to craft a response to an attack that had been so comprehensive and well documented that any defense would only draw more attention to the failures she had exposed. The 24 hours following Caroline Levit's press briefing performance represented a seismic shift in American political discourse that caught even veteran Washington observers off guard. What had started as Barack Obama's casual insult about a young press secretary's marriage had evolved into a comprehensive re-examination of his presidential legacy that threatened to permanently alter his post-presidency reputation. This is unprecedented, observed political historian Dr. Michael Beschloss during an emergency segment on MSNBC. Former presidents have always enjoyed a kind of immunity from serious criticism once they left office. There's an unspoken agreement that you don't systematically attack their records because it undermines the dignity of the office. Caroline Levit just threw that tradition out the window. The cable news networks found themselves in the unusual position of being forced to cover a story that many of their hosts and producers personally disagreed with, but couldn't ignore due to its sheer newsworthiness. Levit's systematic presentation of Obama's policy failures had been so well documented and factually accurate that even sympathetic commentators struggled to find ways to defend the former president's record. The problem for Obama is that everything she said was true, admitted former Obama administration official Van Jones during a CNN panel discussion. We can argue about context and circumstances, but the basic facts about economic growth, healthcare costs, and foreign policy outcomes are all verifiable. She didn't attack him with partisan talking points, she attacked him with his own administration's documented results. But it was the response from Obama's own former staffers that revealed the true devastation of Levit's performance. Instead of mounting a robust defense of their former boss's record, many chose to remain silent or offered only tepid responses that seemed designed more to avoid further attention than to actually rebut her specific criticisms. "What can we say?" one former senior Obama official told Politico on condition of anonymity. She presented accurate statistics about economic growth, verifiable information about healthcare cost increases, and documented foreign policy outcomes. "We can talk about the circumstances we inherited and the constraints we faced, but we can't dispute the basic facts of our record." The silence from Obama himself became increasingly conspicuous as hours turned into days, without any substantive response to Levit's systematic dismantling of his legacy. His social media accounts, normally active with carefully crafted statements about current events, remained notably quiet about the controversy he had initiated. "Obama's team is in crisis mode," reported a source close to the former president. They never expected this level of response to what they thought was a throwaway comment about Trump administration personnel. Now they're dealing with the most comprehensive public criticism of Obama's presidency since he left office, and they don't have a good way to respond without making the story bigger. Meanwhile, Levit had become an overnight sensation among conservative media and Trump supporters who viewed her performance as vindication of everything they had been saying about Obama's presidency for years. But more significantly, she was also gaining grudging respect from mainstream journalists and political observers who had previously dismissed her as an attractive spokesperson without substance. "I have to admit I underestimated her," wrote Washington Post columnist Donna Milbank in a piece that was widely shared across social media. "What she did in that press briefing was masterful political communication. She took a personal attack and used it as a platform to deliver a comprehensive fact-based critique of a former president's record. Whether you agree with her politics or not, you have to respect the skill and preparation that went into that performance." But perhaps the most significant response came from within the Trump administration itself, where Levit's handling of the Obama confrontation had elevated her from press secretary to major political figure virtually overnight. "What Caroline did was extraordinary," President Trump said during an impromptu gaggle with reporters aboard Air Force One. "She showed that when you have the facts on your side and you're willing to fight back, you can beat anyone, even someone like Obama, who the fake news media has been protecting for years. She's exactly the kind of fighter we need in this administration." The endorsement from Trump himself, combined with the widespread coverage of her performance, positioned Levit as one of the rising stars of the conservative movement and a potential future candidate for higher office. But it was the polling data that revealed the true impact of her confrontation with Obama. A survey conducted in the week following the press briefing showed that Obama's approval ratings had dropped 6 points among independent voters, while 47% of respondents said that Levit's presentation had given them a more negative view of Obama's presidency. "This is remarkable data," explained pollster Frank Luntz during a Fox News appearance. "Obama has maintained consistently high approval ratings since leaving office, largely because people remember his personal qualities rather than his policy record. But Levit's systematic presentation of his failures has reminded people of the actual results of his administration, and that's having a measurable impact on his reputation." More significantly, the same polling showed that Levit's own approval ratings had increased dramatically, with 62% of conservative voters and 31% of independents expressing a favorable view of her performance in the Obama confrontation. "She's transformed herself from a Trump administration spokesperson into a national political figure in her own right," observed Republican strategist Karl Rove. "If she decides to run for office in the future, this moment will be remembered as the launching pad for her political career." As the week progressed and the initial shock of the confrontation began to settle, political observers started to analyze the broader implications of what had occurred. Levit hadn't just defended herself against Obama's personal attacks, she had demonstrated that the former president's carefully constructed post-presidency image was vulnerable to sustained fact-based criticism. The question now was whether Obama would attempt to respond to her systematic dismantling of his legacy, or whether he would retreat from public political commentary to avoid further damage to his reputation. 3 weeks after Caroline Levit's devastating press briefing, the full scope of what she had accomplished became clear through a series of developments that permanently altered both participants' positions in American political discourse. Barack Obama, who had entered the controversy as the elder statesman attempting to provide wisdom about political standards, found himself defending a presidential record that millions of Americans were examining critically for the first time since he left office. The most significant change was in media coverage of Obama himself. News organizations that had spent years treating him with the deference typically accorded to former presidents began including more critical analysis of his administration's actual policy outcomes in their reporting. The Levit effect, as political journalists had begun calling it, forced newsrooms to grapple with the gap between Obama's personal popularity and his policy record. Cable news segments that had previously focused on his post-presidency activities and political commentary now included discussions of economic data, foreign policy outcomes, and healthcare statistics from his 8 years in office. What Caroline Levitt did was change the terms of debate about Obama's presidency, explained media critic Jim Rutenberg in a New York Times analysis piece. She forced journalists to engage with the actual record rather than just the narrative, and once you start looking at the data, it's hard to ignore the discrepancies between Obama's rhetoric and his results. The impact was measurable across multiple platforms. Google searches for terms like Obama economic record, Obamacare premium increases, and Obama foreign policy failures increased by over 400% in the weeks following Levit's performance. Wikipedia page views for articles about Obama administration policies spiked dramatically, with particular attention to sections documenting policy outcomes and statistical results. But perhaps the most significant development was Obama's own response to the sustained criticism of his record. After 3 weeks of silence, he agreed to a major interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper, ostensibly to discuss his new book, but actually to address the controversy that Levit had created. I think what we've seen in recent weeks is an unfortunate example of how political discourse has become more personal and less substantive. Obama said during the interview, his tone carrying the familiar mixture of reasonableness and condescension that had characterized his original comments about Levit. But Cooper, influenced by the new environment that Levit had created, pressed Obama on the specific policy criticisms she had raised rather than allowing him to dismiss them with rhetorical flourishes. "But Mr. President," she cited specific statistics about economic growth, healthcare costs, and foreign policy outcomes during your administration. "Are those statistics inaccurate, or do you dispute their significance?" Cooper asked. Obama's response revealed the weakness of his position when forced to defend actual results rather than discussing political philosophy. Anderson, "I think you have to look at the circumstances we inherited and the constraints we faced. We dealt with the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We faced unprecedented Republican obstruction, and we had to work within the limitations of what was politically possible." But the statistics she cited were about outcomes, not intentions. Cooper continued, "GDP growth averaged 1.5% during your presidency. Healthcare premiums did increase substantially, and there were significant foreign policy challenges. How do you respond to those specific criticisms?" The interview continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with Obama appearing increasingly defensive and less commanding than his usual media appearances. The contrast with Levit's confident, fact-based presentation was stark and politically damaging. But it was the social media response to Obama's defensive performance that truly demonstrated how completely the dynamic had changed. Clips from the interview showing Obama struggling to defend his record were shared widely, often alongside footage of Levit's systematic presentation of his failures. "This is what accountability looks like," wrote conservative commentator Ben Shapiro in a widely shared Twitter thread. Obama spent years coasting on his personal charm and rhetorical skills while avoiding serious scrutiny of his actual record. Levit forced that scrutiny, and when he finally had to defend his results, he couldn't do it effectively. More significantly, the response wasn't limited to conservative commentators. Mainstream journalists and even some liberal writers began acknowledging that Levit had raised legitimate questions about Obama's legacy that deserved serious consideration. "I didn't want to admit it at the time, but Levit's critique of Obama's record was largely accurate," wrote liberal columnist Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine. "We spent so much time focusing on Obama's personal qualities and rhetorical abilities that we didn't adequately examine whether his policies actually achieved their stated objectives." The broader impact extended beyond Obama himself to influence how other political figures approached public discourse. The Levit Standard, as it became known, represented a new expectation that political criticism should be based on documented facts and measurable outcomes rather than personal attacks or partisan rhetoric. What she demonstrated is that you can be devastating in political combat without being dishonest, observed Democratic strategist James Carville during a television appearance. She didn't attack Obama's character or make personal accusations. She just presented his actual record and let people draw their own conclusion. As the controversy settled into political history, both participants found their positions fundamentally altered. Obama, who had begun the confrontation as a respected elder statesman, now faced ongoing scrutiny of his presidential record and questions about whether his post-presidency commentary was informed by actual governing success. Levit, meanwhile, had established herself as a major political figure who had demonstrated the ability to hold even the most popular political figures accountable through superior preparation and factual presentation. Speculation about her future political ambitions became a regular feature of conservative media, with many viewing her as a potential candidate for governor, senator, or even higher office. She proved that youth and preparation can defeat experience and reputation when you have the facts on your side, observed Republican strategist Karl Rove. That's a lesson that will influence political communication for years to come. The ultimate lesson of the Obama-Levit confrontation was that carefully constructed political narratives, no matter how well-crafted or widely accepted, remain vulnerable to systematic fact-based criticism. In 60 seconds of devastating television, Caroline Levit had demonstrated that accountability doesn't have an expiration date, and that even former presidents must be prepared to defend their actual records rather than relying on their reputations. The question for future political discourse was whether other young figures would follow Levit's example, using superior preparation and factual precision to challenge established political narratives, regardless of who constructed them or how long they had been accepted as conventional wisdom. The story concludes with both Obama and Levit having permanently altered positions in American political discourse. Obama's legacy faces ongoing scrutiny that he had previously avoided, while Levit establishes herself as a major political figure who demonstrated that factual preparation and strategic communication can defeat even the most carefully constructed political reputation.